Thanks again. Okay. Well, good morning. I want to show you a picture of someone who passed away right near the end of last year. It's Leon Letterman. He was when Carl and I were living in Chicago in 1988, and I was a producer at an all-news radio station. And in 1988, Leon Letterman won the Nobel Prize for Physics. And he was right outside of Chicago in the Fermi National Accelerator Laboratory in the western suburbs, where they have one of those big colliders and stuff. So, he studies particles and atoms, the very essence of the elements of the universe. And he had a real good sense of humor. But here's a man who at once said he was an atheist, and one of the reporters asked, okay, but what holds all of these particles together? And he paused for a moment and said, love. The word love encompasses a wide range of emotions and feelings. Go ahead and put up the next slide there, Duncan. In spiritual circles, we talk about unconditional love, so I wanted to explore that a little bit today. I know here are some of the ways that we can tell that love is expressed. The first, of course, is eros, the erotic. Joseph Campbell said, eros is the zeal of the organs for each other, which I got a kick out of it. Then there's romantic love, which is in a way, you do want to have that close, intimate relationship with another person. So we've felt that. And then, of course, there's family love. I love my mother, I love my father, my sisters, my brothers. There's that kind of love. But then there's agape. And agape is that divine love, that unconditional love that seems to be elusive for a lot of people. It doesn't depend upon people, circumstances, or conditions. But the Bible, of course, has a lot to say about love. So let me rattle off a few of the various Bible verses. First, in the first letter of John in the New Testament, the writer says twice that God is love. God is not necessarily loving. God is the actual elements, the actual essence of love. In the first chapter of Genesis, it said that we're made in the image and after the likeness of God. Well, in that case, we're love. But why do we sometimes feel like we're not expressing love or feeling love? Paul's letter to the Colossians in chapter 3, he lists the various qualities that we need to express in life: patience, tolerance, forgiveness, etc. He finally winds up in verse 14 by saying, and above all of these things, put on love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony. So, like Leon Letterman, it is kind of the spiritual glue that seems to hold everything together. And why can it be so challenging to practice? Well, it appears that it is our purpose to love. And as we express it according to our understanding of it and the various 4 categories that we've got up here. So, each of us has more than enough love to give. Have you noticed that, if we've got a bucket of items and we're handing them out, there's a finite supply there. But love, when I want to express love, it just seems to come from nowhere. But I can feel it through my heart and I can express it and I never run out. Sometimes I feel like maybe I'm choking off the channel a little bit, but I know that I can love at any time, anywhere. Jesus, of course, had plenty to say about love. In fact, you might say that Jesus might say that his religion was love. At one point, Jesus quotes the Old Testament prophet Hosea. It says, I desire mercy and steadfast love and not sacrifice. So in other words, he doesn't want ritual and sacrifice. And that's, a common misperception, or sometimes it's a bit of a practice in some spiritual traditions that you need to sacrifice. Not necessarily. We do, there are times where we have to give up things. And we'll explore that here just a little bit in just a minute. Also, in the Gospel of Matthew, there is a fellow comes up to, one of the scribes comes up to Jesus and says, what is the greatest of the commandments? And Jesus starts out by saying you need to love your heart, your soul, your mind, and you need to love with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, and all your strength. And in that place, he was actually quoting Deuteronomy, one of the Old Testament books, 6th chapter, 4th verse. But then he goes on, but there's another one that's just as important, and that is to love your neighbor as yourself. I find the word as yourself kind of interesting because if we're self-loathing, if we have a lot of anger, we end up expressing that or projecting that on other people. So we can love others provided we have a sense of love or at least respect for ourselves. So as we allow ourselves to just be immersed in love, instead of being love, perhaps embodying love. In the Gospel of John, 13th chapter, 34th verse, Jesus says, "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another, even as I have loved you, that you also love one another. By this all humans will know that you are my disciples, if you express love for one another." So how do we express love for one another? It seems obvious to some and not so much to others. Earlier I mentioned from the letter to the Colossians that we need to express patience, tolerance, and forgiveness. Patience and tolerance are pretty self-explanatory, but forgiveness, that willingness to look at a situation and recognize that perhaps it wasn't all it seemed at the time. The philosopher Nietzsche said, "Nothing consumes a man or woman more than the passion of resentment." And the word resentment, resent, you're resending an old emotion, an old attitude towards someone else, or projecting it onto them. So in using our forgiveness, we can release resentment. For those of you who are familiar with 12-step programs, the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, the 4th step is where you take inventory and you recognize the people or places that you've been that you need to have some sort of a reconciliation with. And in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, it says resentment is the biggest offender. I know Carla and I know a minister who was an addict for many years, an alcoholic. And he liked to share that, that there came that day where he finally realized, I can't do this anymore. He got very involved in unity, became a unity minister. And he said, well, it wasn't until he had the realization that he was holding a resentment towards the years that he had wasted. So he had to actually just forgive himself and recognize the resentment he was feeling was just choking off that vital energy that flows through all of us. A father was trying to discipline his little girl, and he says, "Honey, I love you when you're good." And the little girl said, "But Daddy, I love you all the time." Out of the mouth of babes, the spiritual lessons that come. In the Gospel of Matthew, 5th chapter, 43rd verse. I got a lot of Bible verses today. Jesus updated a Jewish law. He says, "You heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." It overrides that old Jewish law of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. If someone causes you harm, you get the opportunity to cause them an equal harm. And Jesus is saying, no, let go of that. Whatever we hold in mind, whatever we focus on is going to expand. So if we're focusing on resentment or anger or something like that, that's going to expand in our experience. And that's why, if we could just catch ourselves and start to practice shifting to love. As I said last week and many times, you've got these polar opposites of love and fear. Am I coming from love or am I coming from fear? A lot of people think it's hate, but no. Hate is a reaction to fear, to try to feel empowered once again. But it's a negative reaction. So come back to love. Express love in these various situations. For example, one woman said, "Okay, I'll forgive them, but I don't want them to forget that I've forgiven them." Well, that's not true forgiveness. There's a sense like, yes, untying the emotional attachment that we have to a situation. So we learn to forgive. It'll free us of resentment, which, as I said before, chokes off this vital spiritual energies that flow through us. Sometimes we start out by forgiving through grit teeth. Yes, I forgive you. Or I forgive a situation, or sometimes it's just forgiving myself. But yeah, but as I've said many times, if in a situation where we feel the anger, we feel the resentment, if we can just go within and say, okay, God, show me the good in this. Every situation, every person comes to us with an opportunity for us to spiritually grow through the experience. So if you can shift to that, and so many times, when someone has acted in a way that has caused me unpleasantness, if I shift to the attitude of just seeing what's going on within them, I know many times in my life where I've had a negative reaction because I've just had old wounds that, suddenly are surfacing, wanting to be healed. So sometimes if I'm in a conflict with someone, if I can picture that little child that was this person, and perhaps that incident that wounded this person, so that they're trying so hard to get their needs met. So if I can just say, God, show me the good in this situation. On Tuesday, every month, the ministers from Central Florida get together, just kind of compare notes and all of that, and just share some of the things that were going on. And there's a minister up in Gainesville, Eleanor Bentley. She's just been there since the beginning of last year, started at the same time I started here. And she talked about how this woman had come into the church up there in Gainesville, Unity Church. And it was raining, so she was just soaking wet, but she was acting just, frenetic. She was kind of like all over the place. And so Eleanor just decided to get a blanket and just wrapped it around her and held her. And she calmed down, and someone had called the police because they felt, threatened by her. So the police arrived, and Eleanor asked, would you like to go with the police? And she said yes, and she did. And they got her to a psych ward and got an evaluation. Eleanor found out in the coming weeks that this woman had been chained in a basement as a sex slave in Wisconsin. Now, you remember that, there was that story back near the beginning of the year, but this was a different woman, and so she had escaped and she came down to Florida because her family was trying to convince her not to press charges, but she knew she just needed to get out of there. And so all of this stuff was coming up for her, and Eleanor talked about how she was at this one class and kind of acting out, but in the coming weeks, she would come every week, and she did say to Eleanor, Eleanor kind of apologized to her. I'm sorry, you had to go to the police. She said, no, you saved my life. Just by simply expressing, love in the condition she was in. I had a similar experience in Indianapolis when Carl and I were serving there. There was a guy in there who just seemed really, really wired. I think he had some schizophrenia issues or something like that. But on a particular Sunday, I said, well, why don't you come in during the week? Well, let's talk. And I talked with him. And yeah, he was having these kind of episodes where he would kind of be out of this place of reality, as we call it. And he was having all of these visions of basically what unity teaches, that we're all one, that we're all connected. And it was so foreign to him at first. He was just, trying to figure all of this out. So I talked to him and said, well, you're on the right track there, but there does seem to be some biochemical stuff going on here. We might want to set things up with a doctor. And I was able to use, 211 and see who could help them there in Indianapolis, and got them the help. So sometimes, like I said, just tearing down that facade that's in front of us, allows us to see what's really going on. Or at least allows us to drop our defensiveness so the person feels safe with us, to be willing to explore what's going on. So, when we get that revelation, I found more times than not I've needed to just forgive myself for jumping to conclusions or assumptions. At the end of all of our services, we do the prayer for protection by James Dillett Freeman. In another one of his writings, he wrote, "Some say they love God, but not humankind. How can we love harmony and not the music? How can we love life and not the morning? How can we love nature and not the spring? How can we love God and not the likeness of God, which is humankind? So, yeah, it's easy to say that we love God. But where the rubber meets the road, the very practical practice of spiritual advancement is to be willing to love each other, to express love to each other. Often one of the greatest teachers of unconditional love are animals. Many of you have had the experience of the pet that just, I remember seeing this t-shirt, I just wish I was the man my dog thinks I am. My favorite definition of love, though, came from one of the professors at Unity Seminary who's passed away now about 15 years ago, Ed Rabel. He says he defined love as wanting the highest good to unfold for myself, but then also wanting and setting the intention that everyone else has the highest good unfolding for themselves. And I think that's a good definition of love. I have Duncan put up the slide. So, is love unconditional? Well, it is if we love unconditionally. And the best way we can get to that place is to practice. So, use the tool of forgiveness. Ask God, show me the good in this, whatever the situation, or whatever the person, or whatever the unpleasantness. Be willing to release resentment. Strive to express love always. And remember that love can be expressed in many ways. And so these are just 4 categories: eros, romantic, family, and agape. I've got these takeaways printed out on a handout, which is out there on the credenza if you want a copy of it. I know someone had suggested that a couple weeks ago and thought, yeah, that's a good idea. Because I would like to get them printed in the bulletin. Unfortunately, I usually don't finish my Sunday talk until Saturday night around 10 p.m. And sometimes I'm changing it between then and now, so you're never quite sure. So you get that printed out. So it's been said that love is like wildflowers. It's often found in the most unlikely of places. But our Creator wants the creation to express it constantly, everywhere, always. Our video is a 3-minute story from Steve Hartman of the CBS Evening News.